This is Rejected Knowledge. A couple of years ago, I read myself through the book, The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers, who was a muckraking journalist from the turn of the century during the era of the muckraking journalists. Except he, unlike Upton Sinclair and even Ida Tarbell, even still has some renown now. Unlike those two, Gustavus Myers, he is largely forgotten, and I think that's not altogether accidental, because he really went after the oligarchs in America, the real government, in other words. He really laid them bare. He shined a flashlight on those cockroaches, and none of his historical facts, none of his charges were ever proven to be false. And yet his book today, by the, if it ever is talked about in the mainstream media, is castigated as being unfair and mean-spirited. But they never tell you it was false, because it wasn't. But for the most part, though, Gustavus Myers and his work has been flushed down the memory hole. So anyway, yeah, that's up on my archives, on the Ministry of Truth archives. You can get to that through my links page. Gustavus Myers, The History of the Great American Fortunes. And he wrote two other tomes, historical tomes. One of them I'm going to begin in a few seconds here. And what got me wanting to read this? A couple of years back also, I was out of town, and I didn't bring enough books to read. I ran out of books to read, and I had to break down and go to the only game in town, a Borders bookstore. And if you're any kind of regular listener, you know my feelings about big chain bookstores. It's all crap in there. It's all pablum, especially in the history section. It's all whitewashed, vanilla history. You'll never get truth in there, folks. But I had to get something, so I picked up a book called Boss Tweed. I forget the author's name, some mainstream historical hack. And Boss Tweed was the head of something called Tammany Hall, which was a huge, powerful political machine. It's in the 1800s. It was at its zenith, in the mid-1800s. And I wanted to find out a little bit about this Boss Tweed character that his name kept coming up quite a few times peripherally in Gustavus Myers' other work. But he didn't go into Boss Tweed in any kind of detail other than to say the guy was corrupt, basically. So who was this Boss Tweed guy? I said, well, I'll take a chance, see what I can glean from this mainstream historical hack's account of Boss Tweed, the head of the Tammany Hall in the 1800s. What was the guy's name? No, what was his name? Doesn't matter. Anyway, sure enough, I read through it and wanted to puke, because there was nothing there. Sure enough, what was there, the author, the mainstream hack history writer, he blamed all of the corruption on Boss Tweed, and on the only few occasions when the bankers, who, you guys know, the bankers are actually the bosses of the politicians in reality. Well, not in this book, of course, because this book followed the official orthodoxy of our country, of our media. And so, the few times, say, John Jacob Astor, who was as crooked as a trombone, the few times his name came up, was it John Jacob Astor? One of the Astors, I think it was John Jacob. And you know, if you read Gustavus Myers, that the Astors got their fortunes by genociding the Indians and swindling the Indians and poisoning the Indians with whiskey and outright blowing their heads off. You know what had their agents blow their head off. The bankers don't get their actual hands dirty, but they're more than willing to pay hitmen to do it. So the Astors got their fortunes through murder, genocide, and fraud. And yet, in this book, boy, the Astors were respectable bankers. And the Astors and the other bankers looked upon Boss Tweed's corruption as a thing of shame. Like, how could you do that, Boss Tweed? You know, we're entrusting our funds to you, and you are embezzling them. Shame on you. It was just, give me a flipping break. So the bankers got whitewashed. They're angels, and it's all Boss Tweed's fault. Same story we get today. You know, they'll find a rogue politician that, say, like a Daniel Trafficant, that said something he shouldn't have said, and he becomes the scapegoat. Well, all of his bosses and cronies, they get off the hook. Same thing. So, I knew that someday I would want to get into this. This other work by Gustavus Myers. And this other work is called The History of Tammany Hall. If you said Tammany Hall, what was Tammany Hall to the average American, they'd go, what? They'd look at you like those street interviews Jay Leno does, where he asks the most simplest, mundane question, and people's eyes glaze over. We're so dumbed down nowadays in this country. Nobody would know what Tammany Hall is. Nobody would know what Boss Tweed, who that was. But very few people would, but even those people who wouldn't know the real story. I'm guessing we're going to get the real story here on Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, etc., in this Gustavus Myers book. I'm also guessing, I haven't got into this at all yet, and so I'm going into this cold, like I usually do, but I'm guessing there's going to be examples of widespread, rampant voter fraud right from the start, right from the get-go, right from the inception of the country. And of course, that makes all you people who still vote out there today, and in doing so endorse your own slavery, that makes you even more foolish when you consider how utterly futile it is to vote in a system that is so corrupt that the leader has already been handpicked by the oligarchs, and they're just letting you go and push a lever and now hit a computer button, click on a mouse button, and makes you feel good, makes you feel like you did something. You did nothing but endorse your own slavery, and that's about it. I'm guessing that we're going to run into just scores of examples of voter fraud right down through the history of America. And nowadays, of course, it's all the more easier with computer black box voting fraud. But it went on all through history, I'm going to guess. And it wasn't just Kennedy versus Nixon in 1960 either in Chicago. No. It was, well, we'll see. I know Gustavus Myers gets into that a little bit in History of the Great American Fortunes. A few examples of voter fraud. And if you want to know about voter fraud, man, in just about every congressional election, read the book Vote Scam by James and Kenneth Collier. Fantastic book. It reads like a detective novel. It's a page-turner, but it's all factual. Vote Scam by James and Kenneth Collier. Okay. Well, here we go. Chapter 1 of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers. Chapter 1 is entitled Resistance to Aristocracy, 1789 to 1798. The Society of St. Tammany, or Columbian Order, was founded on May 12, 1789, a fortnight later than the establishment of the national government by William Mooney. Says Judah Hammond, an early member of Tammany, Quote, "His object was to fill the country with institutions designed, and men determined, to preserve the just balance of power. His purpose was patriotic and purely republican. The Constitution provided by his care contained, among other things, a solemn asseveration which every member at his initiation was required to repeat and subscribe to, that he would sustain the state institutions and resist a consolidation of power in the general government." Unquote. Before the Revolution, societies variously known as the Sons of Liberty and the Sons of St. Tammany had been formed to aid the cause of independence. Tammany, or Tamanend, was an Indian chief. I never knew that. Of whom fanciful legends have been woven, but of whose real life little can be told. Some maintain that he lived in the neighborhood of Scranton, Pennsylvania, when William Penn arrived, and that he was present at the great council under the elm tree. His name is said to have been on Penn's first treaty with the Indians, April 23, 1683. He is also described as a great chief of the Delaware nation, and his wigwam is said to have stood on the grounds now occupied by Princeton University. The fame of his wisdom, benevolence, and love of liberty spreading to the colonists, they adopted his name for their patriotic lodges. When societies sprang up bearing the names of St. George, St. Andrew, or St. David, and proclaiming their fealty to King George, the separatists dubbed Tammany a saint in ridicule of the imported saints. The Revolution over, the Sons of Liberty and the Sons of St. Tammany dissolved. The controversy over the adoption of the federal Constitution had the effect of reuniting the patriotic lodges. The rich and influential classes favored Hamilton's design of a republic having a president and a Senate chosen for life, and state governments elected by Congress. Opposed to this attempt toward a highly centralized government were the forces which afterward organized the Anti-Federalist Party. Their leader in New York was Governor George Clinton. The greater number of the old members of the Liberty and Tammany societies, now familiarly known as Liberty Boys, belonged to this opposition. During this agitation, Hamilton managed to strengthen his party by causing to be removed, in 1787, the political disabilities bearing upon the Tories. New York was noted for its Tories, more numerous in proportion than in any other colony, since here, under the Crown, offices were dispensed more liberally than elsewhere. In the heat of the Revolutionary War, and the times immediately following it, popular indignation struck at them in severe laws. In all places held by the Patriot Army, a Tory refusing to renounce his allegiance to King George ran considerable danger, not only of mob visit, but of confiscation of property, exile, imprisonment, or, in flagrant cases of adherence to the enemy, death. From 1783 to 1787, the Liberty Boys of the Revolution, who formed the bulk of the middle and working classes, governed New York politics. In freeing the Tories from oppressive laws and opening political life to them, Hamilton at once secured the support of a propertied class, parenthesis, for many of them had succeeded in retaining their estates, end parenthesis, a propertied class numerous enough to form a balance of power and to enable him to wrest the control of the city from the Liberty Boys. The elevation to office of many of the hated aristocratic supporters of Great Britain inflamed the minds of the Liberty Boys and their followers, and made the chasm between the classes, already wide, yet wider. The bitterest feeling cropped out. Hamilton, put upon the defensive, took pains in his addresses to assure the people of the baselessness of the accusation that he aimed to keep the rich families in power. That result, however, had been partially assured by the state constitution of 1777. Gauging sound citizenship by the ownership of property, the draftsman of that instrument allowed only actual residents having freeholds to the value of £100, free of all debts, to vote for governor, and lieutenant governor, and state senators, while a vote for the humbler office of assemblyman was given only to those having freeholds of £20 in the county, or paying 40 shillings rent yearly. Poor soldiers who had nobly sustained the revolutionary cause were justly embittered at being disqualified by reason of their poverty, while full political power was given to the property-owning Tories. Wrote one who lived in those days, quote, "The inequality was greatly added to by the social and business customs of the times. There was an aristocracy and a democracy whose limits were as clearly marked by manner and dress as by legal enactment. The aristocracy controlled capital in trade, monopolized banks and banking privileges, which they did not hesitate to employ as a means of perpetuating their power." Unquote. Dr. John W. Francis tells, in his Reminiscences, of the prevalence in New York, for years after the Revolution, of a supercilious class that missed no opportunity of sneering at the demand for political equality made by the leather-breeched mechanic with his few shillings a day. Has anything ever changed since then? In America? Doesn't sound like it. Not for those who know what's going on nowadays. Continuing. Permeated with democratic doctrines, the populace detested the landed class. The founding of the Society of the Cincinnati was an additional irritant. Formed by the officers of the Continental Army before disbandment, this society adopted one clause especially obnoxious to the radicals. It provided that the eldest male descendant of an original member should be entitled to wear the insignia of the order and enjoy the privileges of the society which, it was argued, would be best perpetuated in that way. Jefferson saw a danger to the liberties of the people in this provision, since it would tend to give rise to a race of hereditary nobles. Well, what do you think we have today with the Rockefellers, etc.? Continuing. Founded on the military, arid breeding in turn other subordinate orders. At Washington's suggestion, the clause was modified, but an ugly feeling rankled in the public mind due to the existence of an active party supposedly bent on the establishment of a disguised form of monarchy. It was at such a juncture of movements and tendencies that the Society of St. Tammany, or Columbian Order, was formed. The new organization constituted a formal protest against aristocratic influences and stood for the widest democratization in political life. As a contrast to the old world distinctions of the Cincinnati and other societies, the Tammany Society adopted aboriginal forms and usages. The officers held Indian titles. The head, or president, chosen from 13 sachems, corresponding to trustees, elected annually, was styled Grand Sachem. In its early years, the society had a custom, now obsolete, of conferring the honorary office of Kichi Okema, or Great Grand Sachem, upon the President of the United States. Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Jackson were hailed successively as the Great Grand Sachems of Tammany. After the sachems came the sagamore, or master of ceremonies, a scribe, or secretary, and a Wiskinski, or doorkeeper. This all sounds very Masonic. Instead of using the ordinary calendar designations, the society divided the year into seasons, and these into moons. Its notices bore reckoning from the year Columbus discovered America, that of the Declaration of American Independence, and of its own organization. Instead of inscribing New York, July 1800, there would appear Manhattan, season of fruits, 7th moon, year of discovery 308th, of independence 24th, and of the institution the 12th. In early times, the society was divided into tribes, one for each of the 13 original states. There were the eagle, otter, panther, beaver, bear, tortoise, rattlesnake, tiger, fox, deer, buffalo, raccoon, and wolf tribes, which stood respectively for New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. A new member of the Tammany Society had the choice of saying to which of these tribes he cared to be attached. Frequently the members dressed in Indian garb and carried papooses in their public parades. They introduced the distinction between long talks and short talks in their public addresses. the name wigwam was given to their meeting place, and Barden's Tavern was selected as their first home. At the initiation of the Grand Sachem, a song beginning, "Brothers, our council fire shines bright," was sung, and at the initiation of a member, another song was sung, beginning, "Sacred's the ground where freedom's found, and virtue stamps her name." The society contemplated founding a chain of Tammany societies over the country, and accordingly designated itself as Tammany Society Number 1. A number sprang into life, but only a few. Those in Philadelphia, Providence, Brooklyn, and Lexington, Kentucky, continued for any time, and even these disappeared about the year 1818, or a few years later. So this explains why there was only one in New York. Tammany Hall in New York. Okay, I get it. The society showed its Indian ceremonies to advantage and gained much prestige by aiding in the conciliation of the Creek Indians. After useless attempts to make a treaty with them, the government undertook, as a last resort, in February 1790, to influence Alexander McGillivray, their half-breed chief, to visit New York, where he might be induced to sign a treaty. To Colonel Marinus Willett, a brave soldier of the Revolution and later mayor of New York City, the mission was entrusted. In July 1790, Willett started north, accompanied by McGillivray and 28 Creek chiefs and warriors. Upon their arrival in New York, then the seat of the national government, the members of the Tammany Society, in full Indian costume, welcomed them. One phase of the tale has it that the Creeks set up a wild whoop, at whose terrifying sound the Tammany make-believe red faces fled in dismay. Another version tells that the Tammany Society and the military escorted the Indians to Secretary Knox's house, introduced them to Washington, and then led them to the wigwam at Barden's Tavern, where seductive drink was served. That sounds pretty accurate. On August 2nd, the Creeks were entertained at a Tammany banquet. A treaty was signed on August 13th. In June of the same year, Tammany had established, in the old City Hall, a museum, quote, "for the preservation of Indian relics," unquote. For a brief while, the society devoted itself with assiduity to this department. But the practical men grew tired of it. On June 25th, 1795, the museum was given over to Gardiner Baker, its curator, on condition that it was to be known for all time as the Tammany Museum, and that each member of the society and his family were to have entrance free. Baker dying, the museum eventually passed into the hands of a professional museum owner. Tammany's chief functions at first seem to have been the celebration of its anniversary day, May 12th, the 4th of July, and Evacuation Day. The Society's parades were events in Old New York. On May 12th, 1789, the day of organization, 2 marquees were built 2 miles above the city, whither the Tammany brethren went to hold their banquet. 13 discharges of cannon followed each toast. The first one read, "May honor, virtue, and patriotism ever be the distinguishing characteristics of the sons of St. Tammany." John Pintard, Tammany's first sagamore, wrote an account of the Society's celebration of May 12, 1791. He says, quote, "The day was ushered in by a federal salute from the battery and welcomed by a discharge of 13 guns from the brig Grand Sachem, lying in the stream. The society assembled at the great wigwam in Broad Street 5 hours after the rising of the sun, and was conducted from there in an elegant procession to the brick meeting house in Beekman Street. Before them was borne the cap of liberty, after following 7 hunters in tamanial dress, then the great standard of the society, in the rear of which was the great sachem and other officers. On either side of these were formed the members in tribes, each headed by its standard-bearers and sachem in full dress." These are grown men doing this. At the brick meeting house, an oration was delivered by their brother, Josiah Ogden Hoffman, to the society and to a most respectable and crowded audience. In the most brilliant and pathetic language he traced the origin of the Columbian Order and the Society of the Cincinnati. From the meeting-house the procession proceeded, as before, to Campbell's grounds, where upwards of 200 people partook of a handsome and plentiful repast. The dinner was honored by His Excellency George Clinton and many of the most respectable citizens." Unquote. The toasts that now seem so quaint mirror the spirit of the diners. Quote, "The Grand Sachem of the 13 United Fires," unquote, ran the first, quote, "may his declining sun be precious in the sight of the Great Spirit, that the mild luster of his departing beams may prove no less glorious than the effulgence of the rising or transcendent splendor of his meridian greatness." Unquote. The second, quote, "The headmen and chiefs of the Grand Council of the 13 United Fires, may they convince our foes not only of their courage to lift, prudence to direct, and clemency to withhold the hatchet, but of their power to inflict it in their country's cause." Unquote. Up to 1835, at least, toasts were an important feature in public dinners, as they were supposed to disclose the sentiments, political or otherwise, of the person or body from whom they came. In this fashion, the Tammany Society announced its instant sympathy with the French Revolution in all its stages. On May 12, 1793, the 6th toast read, quote, "Success to the armies of France, and wisdom, concord, and firmness to the Convention." Unquote. Quote, "The first sentence was hardly articulated," unquote, a newspaper records, quote, "when as one the whole company arose and gave 3 cheers, continued by roars of applause for several minutes. The toast was then given in whole, and the applauses reiterated." Unquote. At 10 o'clock that morning, the same account relates, quote, "The society had assembled at Tammanial Hall in Broad Street, and marched to St. Paul's Church, where Brother Cadwallader D. Colden delivered to a crowded and brilliant audience an animated talk on the excellence of the government and situation of the United States when contrasted with those of despotic countries, unquote. In the procession were about 400 members in civilian dress. From each hat flowed a bucktail, the symbol of liberty, and the standard and cap of liberty were carried in front of the line. From the church, quote, the Tammanyals went to their hall, where some 150 of them partook of an elegant dinner, unquote. Public feeling ran high in discussing the French Revolution, and there were many personal collisions. The Tammany Society was in the vanguard of the American sympathizers and bore the brunt of abuse. The pamphlets and newspapers were filled with anonymous threats from both sides. Quote-unquote, an Oneida chief writes in the New York Journal and Patriotic Register, June 8, 1793, quote, a hint to the Whigs of New York, to hear our brethren of France vilified, parentheses, with all that low scurrility of which their enemies, the English, are so well stocked, end parentheses, vilified in our streets and on the wharves, nay, in our new and elegant coffee-house, but more particularly in that den of ingrates called Belvedere Club House, where, at this very moment, those enemies to liberty are swallowing potent draughts to the destruction and annihilation of liberty, equality, and the rights of man, is not to be borne by free men. And I am fully of opinion that if some method is not adopted to suppress such daring and presumptuous insults, a band of determined Mohawks, Oneidas, or Senecas will take upon themselves that necessary duty, unquote. There is no record of the carrying out of this threat. Despite its original composition of men of both parties, the Tammany Society drifted year by year into being the principal upholder of the doctrines of which Jefferson was the chief exponent. Toward the end of Washington's administration, political feelings developed into violent party divisions, and the Tammany Society became largely anti-Federalist, or Republican, the Federalist members either withdrawing or being reduced to a harmless minority. It toasted the Republican leaders vociferously to show the world its sympathies and principles. On May 12, 1796, the glasses ascended to Citizen Thomas Jefferson, whose name was received with 3 cheers, and to Citizen Edward Livingston, for whom 9 cheers were given. Quote, the people, unquote, ran one toast. Quote, may they ever, at the risk of life and liberty, support their equal rights in opposition to ambition, tyranny, to sophistry and deception, to bribery and corruption, and to an enthusiastic fondness and implicit confidence in their fellow fallible mortals, unquote. Tammany had become, by 1796 to 1797, a powerful and an extremely partisan body. But it came near being snuffed out of existence in the last year of Washington's presidency. Judah Hammond writes that when Washington, before the close of his second term, quote, rebuked self-creative societies from an apprehension that their ultimate tendency would be hostile to the public tranquility, the members of Tammany supposed their institution to be included in the reproof, and they almost all forsook it. The founder, William Mooney, and a few others continued steadfast. At one anniversary, they were reduced so low that but 3 persons attended its festival. From this time, it became a political institution and took ground with Thomas Jefferson, unquote. To such straits was driven the society which, a short time after, secured absolute control of New York City, and which has held that grasp with but few and brief intermissions ever since. The contrast between that sorry festival, with its trio of lonesome celebrators, and the Tammany Society of a few years afterwards, presents one of the most striking pictures in American politics. Chapter 2. Aaron Burr at the helm, 1798 to 1802. The second period of the Tammany Society began about 1798. Relieved of its Federalist members, it became purely partisan. As yet, it was not an quote-unquote organization in the modern political sense. It did not seek the enrollment and regimentation of voters. Its nature was more that of a private political club, which sought to influence elections by speeches, pamphlets, and social means. It shifted its quarters from Barden's Tavern to the Long Room, a place kept by a sometime sachem, Abraham or Brom Martling, at the corner of Nassau and Spruce Streets. This wigwam was a forlorn one-story wooden building attached to Martling's Tavern, near or partly overlapping the spot where subsequently Tammany Hall erected its first building, recently the Sun newspaper building. No larger than a good-sized room, the wigwam was contemptuously styled by the Federalists, quote-unquote, the pig pen. In that year, New York City had only 58,000 inhabitants. The wigwam stood on the very outskirts of the city, but it formed a social rendezvous very popular with the bucktails of the time. Every night men gathered there to drink, smoke, and swap stories. Fritz Green Halleck has written of a later time, quote, "There's a barrel of porter at Tammany Hall, and the bucktails are swigging it all the night long. In the time of my boyhood 'twas pleasant to call for a seat and cigar mid the jovial throng." Unquote. This social custom was begun early in the life of the society and was maintained for several decades. Aaron Burr was the first real leader of the Tammany Society. He was never Grand Sachem or even Sachem. It is doubtful whether he ever set foot in the wigwam. It is known that it was never his habit to attend caucuses, but he controlled the society through his friends and protégés. The transition of Tammany from an effusive, speech-making society to an active political club was mainly through his instrumentality. Mooney was a mediocre man, delighting in extravagant language and Indian ceremonials, and was merely a tool in the hands of far abler men. Quote, "Burr was our chief," unquote, said Matthew L. Davis, Burr's friend and biographer, and several times Grand Sachem of the Society. Davis's influence on the early career of Tammany was second only to that of Burr himself. He was reputed to be the originator of the time-honored modes of manufacturing public opinion, carrying primary meetings, obtaining the nomination of certain candidates, carrying a ward, a city, a county, or even a state. During one period of his activity, it is related, meetings were held on different nights in every ward in New York City. The most forcible and spirited resolutions and addresses were passed and published. Not only the city, but the entire country was aroused. It was some time before the secret was known that at each of these meetings but 3 persons were present, Davis and 2 friends. Though Davis was credited with the authorship of these methods, it is not so certain that he did not receive his lessons from Burr. Besides Davis, Burr's chief protégés, all of whom became persons of importance in early New York, were Jacob Barker, John and Robert Swartwout, John and William P. Van Ness, Benjamin Romaine, Isaac Pearson, John P. Half, and Jacob Hayes. When Burr was in disgrace, William P. Van Ness, at that time the patron of the law student Martin Van Buren, wrote a long pamphlet defending him. At the time of his duel with Hamilton, these men supported him. They made Tammany his machine, and it is clear that they were attached to him sincerely, for long after his trial for treason, Tammany Hall, under their influence, tried unsuccessfully to restore him to some degree of political power. Burr controlled Tammany Hall from 1797 until even after his fall. From then on to about 1835, his protégés either controlled it or were its influential men. The phrase, quote, "the old Burr faction still active," unquote, is met with as late as 1832. And the Burrites were a considerable factor in politics for several years thereafter. Nearly every one of the Burr leaders, as will be shown, was guilty of some act of official or private peculation. These were the men Burr used in changing the character of the Tammany Society. The leader and his satellites were quite content to have the Tammany rank and file parade in Indian garb and use savage ceremonies. Such forms gave the people an idea of pristine simplicity, which was a good enough cloak for election scheming. Audacious to a degree, and working through others, Burr was exceedingly adroit. One of his most important moves was the chartering of the Manhattan Bank. Without this institution, Tammany would have been quite ineffective. In those days, banks had a mightier influence over politics than is now thought. New York had only one bank, and that one was violently Federalist. Its affairs were administered always with a view to contributing to Federalist success. The directors loaned money to their personal and party friends with gross partiality and for questionable purposes. If a merchant dared help the opposite party or offended the directors, he was taught to repent his independence by a rejection of his paper when he most needed cash. Burr needed this means of monopoly and favoritism to make his political machine complete, as well as to amass funds. He, therefore, had introduced into the legislature in 1799 a bill apparently for the purpose of diminishing the future possibility of yellow fever in New York City. I know where he's going here, because Gustavus Myers covers this in The History of the Great American Fortunes. They passed this bill supposedly to cure yellow fever in New York City, and they didn't cure a damn thing, and it was all about profit. Profit, profit, profit. Same old, same old. Okay, let's continue. Meanwhile, people die. Hey man, the bankers have murdered more people than any group of serial murders you could ever imagine. Continuing. He, therefore, had introduced into the legislature in 1799 a bill, apparently for the purpose of diminishing the future possibility of yellow fever in New York City, incorporating a company styled the Manhattan Company to supply pure, wholesome water. Supposing the charter granted nothing more than this, the legislators passed it. They were much surprised later to hear that it contained a carefully worded clause vesting the Manhattan Company with banking powers. The Manhattan Bank speedily adopted the prevailing partisan tactics. The campaign of 1800 was full of personal and party bitterness and was contested hotly. To evade the election laws disqualifying the poor and working to the advantage of the Federalists, Tammany had recourse to artifice. Poor Republicans, being unable individually to meet the property qualification, clubbed together and bought property. On the 3 election days, Hamilton made speeches at the polls for the Federalists, and Burr directed political affairs for the Republicans. Tammany used every influence, social and political, to carry the city for Jefferson. Assemblymen then were not elected by words, but in bulk. The legislature, in turn, selecting the presidential electors. The Republican Assembly candidates in New York City were elected by a majority of 1, the vote of a butcher, Thomas Winship, being the decisive ballot. The legislature selected Republican electors. This threw the presidential contest into the House of Representatives, ensuring Jefferson's success. Though Burr was the choice of the Tammany chiefs, Jefferson was a favored second. Tammany claimed to have brought about the result, and the claim was generally allowed. The success of the Republicans in 1800 opened new possibilities to the members of the Tammany Society. Jefferson richly rewarded some of them with offices. In 1801, they advanced their sway further. The Society had declared that one of its objects was the repeal of the odious election laws. For the present, however, it schemed to circumvent them. The practice of the previous year of the collective buying of property to meet the voting qualifications was continued. Under the Society's encouragement, and with money probably furnished by it, 39 poor Republicans in November 1801 bought a house and a lot of ground in the 5th Ward. Their votes turned the ward election. The 39 were mainly penniless students and mechanics. Among them were such men as Daniel D. Tompkins, future governor of New York and vice president of the United States; Richard Riker, coming recorder of New York City; William P. Van Ness, United States judge-to-be; Tunis Wortman, William A. Davis, Robert Swartwout, and John L. Broome, all of whom became men of power. The result in the 5th Ward and in the 4th Ward, where 70 Tammany votes had been secured through the joint purchase of a house and lot at 50 Day Street, gave the Society a majority in the Common Council. The Federalist aldermen decided to throw out these votes as being against the spirit of the law, and to seat their own party candidates. The Republican mayor, Edward Livingston, who presided over the deliberations, maintained that he had a right to vote. His vote made a tie. The Tammany, or Republican men, were arbitrarily seated, upon which, on December 14th, 1801, 8 Federalists seceded to prevent a quorum. They did not return until the following March. The Tammany Society members, as they were called until 1818 or 1814, the Martling men, from their meeting place, soon had a far more interesting task than fighting Federalists. This was the long, bitter warfare, extending over 26 years, which they waged against DeWitt Clinton, one of the ablest politicians New York has known, and remembered by a grateful posterity as the creator of the Erie Canal. Chapter 3. Tammany quarrels with DeWitt Clinton, 1802 to 1809. The quarrel between Tammany and DeWitt Clinton arose from Clinton's charge in 1802 that Burr was a traitor to the Republican Party and had conspired to defeat Jefferson. DeWitt Clinton was a nephew of George Clinton. When a very young man, he was scribe of the Tammany Society. Owing to the influence of his powerful relative, backed by his own ability, he had become a United States Senator at the promising age of 33. His principal fault was his unbridled temper, which led him to speak harshly of those who displeased him. George Clinton thought himself, on account of his age and long public service, entitled to the place and honors heaped upon Burr, whom he despised as an unprincipled usurper. He was too old, however, to carry on a contest, and DeWitt Clinton undertook to shatter the Burr faction for him. To oppose the Tammany Society, which embraced in itself nearly all there was of the Republican Party in New York City, was no slight matter. But DeWitt Clinton, with the confidence that comes of steady, rapid advancement, went about it aggressively. He had extraordinary qualities of mind and heart, which raised him far above the mere politicians of his day. Some of the elective offices, as were allowed the city, were filled by the Tammany Republicans from 1800 to 1809. State senators, assemblymen, and aldermen were elective, but the mayor, sheriff, recorder, justices of the peace of counties, in fact, nearly all civil and military officers, from the heads of departments and judgeships of the Supreme Court down to even auctioneers, were appointed by a body at Albany known as the Council of Appointment, which was one of the old constitutional devices for centralizing political power. 4 state senators chosen by the Assembly comprised, with the governor, this council. Governor Clinton, as president of this board, claimed the exclusive right of nomination and effectually concentrated in himself all the immense power it yielded. He had DeWitt Clinton transferred from the post of United States Senator to that of Mayor of New York City in 1803, and filled offices in all the counties with his relatives or partisans. The spoils system was in full force, as exemplified by the council's sudden and frequent changes. Though swaying New York City, Tammany could get only a few state and city offices, the Clintons holding the power elsewhere throughout the state and in the Council of Appointment. Hence, in fighting the Clintons, Tammany confronted a power much superior in resources. One of the first moves of the Clintons was to get control of the Manhattan Bank. They caused John Swartwout, Burr's associate director, to be turned out. Some words ensued, and DeWitt Clinton styled Swartwout a liar, a scoundrel, and a villain. Swartwout set about resenting the insult in the gentlemanly mode of the day. Clinton readily accepted a challenge, and 5 shots were fired, 2 of which hit Swartwout, who, upon being asked whether he had had enough, said that he had not. But the duel was stopped by the seconds. While the Clintons were searching for a good pretext to overthrow Burr, the latter injudiciously supplied it himself when in 1804 he opposed the election of Morgan Lewis, his own party's nominee for governor. Burr's action gave rise to much acrimony, and from that time he was ostracized by every part of the Republican Party in New York, except the chiefs of the Tammany Society, or Martling men. He fell altogether into disgrace with the general public when he shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel, July 11th, 1804. Tammany, however, still clung to him. Two of Tammany's chiefs, Nathaniel Pendleton and William P. Van Ness, accompanied Burr to the field. John Swartwout, another chief, was at Burr's house awaiting his return. The Tammany men looked upon much of the excitement over Hamilton's death as manufactured. But, as if to yield to public opinion, the Society on July 13th issued a notice to its members to join in the procession to pay the, quote, last tribute of respect to the manes of Hamilton, unquote. In the inflamed state of public feeling which condemned everything connected with Burr and caused his indictment in 2 states, the sachems knew it would be unwise for a time to make any attempt to restore him to political power. They found their opportunity in December 1805 when, strangely enough, DeWitt Clinton, forced by the exigencies of politics, made overtures to form a union with the Burrites in order to resist the powerful Livingston family, which, with Governor Morgan Lewis at its head, was threatening the Clinton family. The Burrites thought they would get the better of the bargain and be able to reinstate their chief. The negotiators met secretly February 20th, 1806, at Dides Hotel. John Swartwout and the other Tammany chiefs insisted, as conditions of the union, that Burr should be recognized as a Republican, that his friends should be well cared for in the distribution of offices, and that, quote-unquote, Burrism should never be urged as an objection against them. The Clintons, anxious to beat down the Livingstons, were ready to agree to these terms, knowing that Burr's prestige was utterly swept away, and that any effort of his followers to thrust him forward again would be a failure. Clintonites and Burrites set to drinking hilariously as a token of goodwill, but their joy was premature. When the body of the Tammany men learned of the arrangement, they were aroused. The sachems drew off, and the Tammany Society continued to revile Clinton and to be reviled in return. It was just before this that the Tammany Hall political organization, as apparently distinct from the Tammany Society, was created. In 1805, the Society made application for, and obtained from the legislature, the charter, which still remains in force, incorporating it as a benevolent and charitable body, quote, for the purpose of affording relief to the indigent and distressed members of said association, their widows and orphans, and others who may be proper objects of their charity, unquote. The wording of the charter deluded only the simple. Everybody knew that the society was the center around which the Republican politics of the city revolved. It had its public and its secret aspects. Quote, this society, unquote, says Longworth's American Almanac, New York Register, and City Directory for 1807 to 1808, in a description of Tammany, quote, has a constitution in 2 parts, public and private, The public relates to all external or public matters, and the private to the arcana and all transactions which do not meet the public eye, and on which its code of laws are founded." Unquote. Sounds Freemasonic to me. The sachems knew that to continue appearing as a political club would be most impolitic. Year after year, since 1798, the criticisms directed at the self-appointed task of providing candidates for the popular suffrage grew louder. In 1806, these murmurings extended to Tammany's own voters. Honest Republicans began to voice their suspicions of caucuses which never met, and public meetings called by nobody knew whom. The sachems, though perfectly satisfied with the established forms which gave them such direct authority, wisely recognized the need of a change. It was agreed that the Republicans should assemble in each ward to choose a ward committee of 3, and that these ward committees should constitute a general committee which should have the power of convening all public meetings of the party and of making preparatory arrangements for approaching elections. This was the origin of the Tammany Hall General Committee, which, consisting then of 30 members, has been expanded in present times to over 5,000 members. At about the same time, each of the 10 wards began sending 7 delegates to Martlings, the 70 forming a nominating committee, which alone had the right to nominate candidates. The 70 met in open convention. At times, each member would have a candidate for the assembly, to which the city then sent 11 members. These improvements on the old method gave, naturally, an air of real democracy to the proceedings of the Tammany faction in the city, and had the effect of softening public criticism. Yet, behind the scenes, the former leaders contrived to bring things about pretty much as they planned. The action of the nominating committee was not final, however. It was a strict rule that the committee's nominations be submitted to the wards and to a later meeting of all the Republican electors who chose to attend and who would vote their approval or disapproval. If a name were voted down, another candidate was substituted by the meeting itself. This was called the, quote, Great Popular Meeting, unquote, and its design was supposed to vest fully in the Republican voters the choice of the candidates for whom they were to vote. But in those days, as has always been the case, most voters were so engrossed in their ordinary occupations that they gave little more attention to politics than to vote, and the leaders, except on special occasions, found it easy to fill the great popular meeting, as well as other meetings, with their friends and creatures, sending out runners, and often in the winter, sleighs for the dilatory. To the general and nominating committees was added, several years later, a correspondence committee, which was empowered to call meetings of the party when necessary, the leaders having found the general committee too slow and cumbersome a means through which to reach that important end. To hold public favor, the Tammany Society thought prudent to make it appear that it was animated by patriotic motives instead of the desire for offices, that the people might see how dearly, above all things, Tammany prized its revolutionary traditions. The Society, on April 13th, 1808, marched in rank to Wallabout, where it laid the cornerstone of a vault in which were to be placed the bones of 11,500 patriots who had died on board the British prison ships. On April 26th, the vault being completed, the remains were laid in it. The Tammany Society, headed by Benjamin Romaine and the military, the municipal officials, Governor Daniel D. Tompkins, members of Congress, Army and Navy officers, and many other detachments of men of lesser note, participated in the ceremony. The Federalists maintained that Tammany's patriotic show was merely an election maneuver. Subsequent developments did not help to disprove the charge. The Society proclaimed far and wide its intention of building a monument over the vault, and induced the legislature to make a grant of land worth $1,000 for the purpose. Associations and individuals likewise contributed. The political ceremonies connected with the burial having their expected effect, Tammany forgot altogether about its project until ugly rumors, pointing to the misuse of the money collected, forced the Society in 1821 to petition the legislature for further aid in erecting the monument. On that occasion, the Tammany Society was denounced bitterly. It was brought out that such was Tammany's interest in the monument that no request was ever made for the land granted by the legislature in 1808. The legislature, however, granted $1,000 in cash. This sum was not enough, and as Tammany did not swell the amount, though its sachems were rich with the spoils of office, a resolution was introduced in the Assembly, March 4th, 1826, stating that as the $1,000 appropriated February 27, 1821, had not been used for the purpose, but remained in the hands of Benjamin Romaine, the Society's treasurer, it should be returned, and threatened legal proceedings in case it was not. This resolution, slightly amended, was passed on a close vote. There is, however, no available record of what became of the $1,000. During 3 years, culminating in 1809, a series of disclosures regarding the corruption of Tammany officials astounded the city. Rumors grew so persistent that the Common Council was forced by public opinion to investigate. In the resultant revelations, many Tammany chiefs suffered. Benjamin Romaine, variously sachem and grand sachem, was removed in 1806 from the office of city controller for malfeasance, though the Common Council was controlled by his own party. As a trustee of corporation property, he had fraudulently obtained valuable land in the heart of the city without paying for it. The affair caused a very considerable scandal. The Common Council had repeatedly passed strong resolutions calling on him to explain. Romaine must have settled it in some fashion, for there is no evidence that he was prosecuted. On January 26, 1807, Philip I. Arcularius, superintendent of the almshouse, and Cornelius Warner, superintendent of public repairs, were removed summarily. It was shown that Warner had defrauded the city as well as the men who worked under him. Oh boy. My buddy Mr. Swan is gonna love hearing that. Yeah. Say no more. Continuing. Jonas Humbert, inspector of bread and sometimes sachem, was proved to have extorted a third of the fees collected by Flour Inspector Jones, under the threat of having Jones put out of office. In consequence of the facts becoming known, Humbert and his associate inspector, Christian Nestel, discreetly resigned their offices, probably to avert official investigation. Abraham Stagg, another of the dynasty of Grand Sachems, as collector of assessments, failed, it was disclosed in 1808, to account for about $1,000. Two other assessment collectors, Samuel L. Page, for a long time prominent in Tammany councils, and Simon Ackerman, were likewise found to be embezzlers. Stagg and Page managed to make good their deficit by turning over to the city certain property, but Ackerman disappeared. John Bingham, at times sachem, and a noted politician of the day, managed, through his position as an alderman, to wheedle the city into selling to his brother-in-law land which later he influenced the corporation to buy back at exorbitant price. The Common Council, spurred by public opinion, demanded its reconveyance. Even Bingham's powerful friend, Matthew L. Davis, could not silence the scandal, for Davis himself had to meet a charge that, while defending the embargo at Martling's, he was caught smuggling out flour in quantities that yielded him a desirable income. But worse than these disclosures was that affecting the Society's founder, William Mooney. The Common Council, in 1808, appointed him superintendent of the almshouse, at an annual recompense of $1,000, and the support of his family in the place, provided that this latter item should not amount to over $500. Mooney had a more exalted idea of how he and his family ought to live. In the summer of 1809, the city fathers appointed a committee to investigate. The outcome was surprising. Mooney had spent nearly $4,000 on himself and family in addition to his salary. He had taken from the city supplies about $1,000 worth of articles, and moreover had expended various sums for, quote, trifles for Mrs. Mooney, unquote, a term which survived for many years in local politics. The oft-times Grand Sachem of the Tammany Society could not explain his indulgences satisfactorily, and the Common Council relieved him of the cares of office, only one alderman voting for his retention. Most of these leaders were only momentarily incommoded, the Tammany Society continuing, many of them, for years after, in positions of trust and influence. Mooney subsequently was repeatedly chosen Grand Sachem and father of the council. Romaine was elected Grand Sachem in 1808, again in 1818, and frequently Sachem. Matthew L. Davis was elected Grand Sachem in 1814, and re-elected in 1815, and was a sachem for years later. Abraham Stagg remained a leader, and continued to get contracts for street paving and regulating, and neither Jonas Humbert nor John Bingham suffered a loss of influence with the wigwam men. Meanwhile, the sachems were professing the highest virtue. The society's calls for meetings ran like this, quote, Tammany Society, or Columbian Order, Brothers, you are requested to assemble around the council fire in the great wigwam, number 1, on Saturday, the 12th, at 9 o'clock a.m. Wear your bucktail in your hat to celebrate the anniversary of the Columbian Order and recount to each other the deeds of our departed chiefs and warriors in order that it may stimulate us to imitate them in whatever is virtuous and just. Unquote. The public, however, took another view of the matter. These scandals and the showing of a deficit in the city's accounts of $250,000 hurt Tammany's prestige considerably. The Republican strength in the city at the election of April 1809 showed a decrease of 600 votes, the majority being only 116, while the Federalists carried the state and thus secured control of the Council of Appointment. The lesson was lost on the leaders. The society at this time was led by various men, of whom Tunis Wortman was considered the chief power. Wortman was as enraged at the defection of these few hundred voters as his successors were, at a later day, at an adverse majority of tens of thousands. He caused a meeting to be held at Martlings on May 19th and secured the appointment of a committee with one member from each of the 10 wards, instructed to inquire into the causes contributing to lessen Tammany's usual majority. The committee was further instructed to call a general meeting of the Republican citizens of the county on the completion of its investigation, and to report to them that it might be known who were their friends and who their enemies. Here is to be seen the first manifestation of that systematic discipline which Tammany Hall thereafter exercised. Wortman's plan excited both Clintonites and Federalists. The committee was called, quote-unquote, the Committee of Spies, and was regarded generally as the beginning of a system of intimidation and proscription. In the passionate acrimony of the struggle between Tammany and the Clintons, the Federalists seemed to be well nigh forgotten. The speakers and writers of each side assailed the other with great fury. One of these was James Cheatham, a Clinton supporter and editor of the American Citizen. Goaded by his strictures, the Tammany Society, on the night of February 28, 1809, expelled him from membership on the grounds that he had assailed the general government and vilified Jefferson. In the American Citizen of March 1st, Cheatham replied that the resolution was carried by trickery. Says Cheatham, quote, Tammany Society was chartered by the legislature of the state for charitable purposes. Not a member of the legislature, when it was chartered, imagined, I dare say, that it would be thus perverted to the worst purposes of faction. Unquote. On May 1st, he sent this note to the Grand Sachem, quote, Sir, I decline membership in Tammany Society. Originally national and republican, it has degenerated into a savage barbarity. Unquote. Cheatham then wrote to Grand Sachem Cowdrey for a certified copy of the proceedings, saying he wanted it to base an action which he would bring for the annulment of the charter of the Tammany Society for misuser. Cowdery expressed regret at not being able to accommodate him. Cowdery wrote, quote, "Tammany Society is an institution that has done much good, and may, and undoubtedly will do more. I do not think one ever can, or ought to, cancel its long list of good actions, and wrest from it its charter of incorporation, the basis of its stability and existence." Unquote. The American citizen thereupon bristled with fiercer attacks upon Tammany. Quote, "Jacobin clubs," unquote, says, quote, "a disciple of Washington," unquote, in this newspaper, July 28, 1809, quote, "are becoming organized to overawe not only the electors, but the elected under our government. Such are the Washington and the Tammany societies. The latter was originally instituted for harmless purposes, and long remained harmless in its acts. Members from all parties were admitted to it, but we have seen it become a tremendous political machine. The Washington Jacobin Club, it is said, consists of at least 2,000 rank and file, and the Tammany Jacobins to perhaps as many. The time will come, and that speedily, when the legislature, the governor, and the council of appointment shall not dare to disobey their edicts." Unquote. Tammany retaliated upon Cheatham by having a bill passed by the legislature, taking away from him the position of state printer, which paid $3,000 a year. Tammany's comparative weakness in the city, as shown in the recent vote, prompted Clinton to suggest a compromise and union of forces. Overtures were made by his agents, and on July 13, 1809, 28 of the leaders of the Clinton, Madison, Burr, and Lewis factions met in a private room at Coleman's Fair House. Matthew L. Davis told them the chiefs ought to unite. Experience demonstrated that if they did, they would lead the rest, meaning the voters. Tammany, he said, welcomed a union of the Republican forces so as to prevent the election of a Federalist Council of Appointment. Davis and Wortman proposed that they unite to prevent any removals from office, that the two opposition Republican clubs in turn should be destroyed, and that their members should go back to the Tammany Society, which, being on the decline, must be reinforced, or, if it should be thought advisable, to put down the Tammany Society, quote, considering its prevailing disrepute, unquote, then a new society should be organized in which Burrites, Lewisites, Clintonites, and Madisonians were to be admitted members under the general family and brotherly name of Republican. DeWitt Clinton cautiously kept away from this meeting, allowing his lieutenants to do the work of outwitting Tammany. A committee of 10 was appointed to consider whether a coalition of the chiefs were practicable, whether, if it were, the people would agree to it, whether the Whig, opposition Republican, clubs should be destroyed, and whether the Tammany Society should be reinforced. The meeting came to naught. In this effort to win over the Tammany chiefs, DeWitt Clinton abandoned his protege and dependent, Cheatham, who had made himself obnoxious to them. finding Clinton's political and financial support withdrawn, Cheatham, out of revenge, published the proceedings of this secret meeting in the American Citizen, and, awakening public indignation, closed the bargain. A few nights later, a Tammany mob threw brickbats in the windows of Cheatham's house. By his death, on September 19, 1810, Tammany was freed from one of its earliest and most vindictive assailants. Okay, folks, that's it for this time. This has been chapters 1, 2, and 3 from The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers from the turn of the 20th century. More rejected knowledge. Thanks for listening. Now, what was his name? Doesn't matter. Anyway, sure enough, I read through it and wanted to puke because there was nothing there. Sure enough, what was there, the author, the mainstream hack history writer, he blamed all of the corruption on Boss Tweed, and on the only few occasions when the bankers, who, you guys know, the bankers are actually the bosses of the politicians in reality. Well, not in this book, of course, because this book followed the official orthodoxy of our country, of our media. And so, the few times, say, John Jacob Astor, who was as crooked as a trombone, the few times his name came up. Was it John Jacob Astor? One of the Astors, I think it was John Jacob. And you know, if you read Gustavus Myers, that the Astors got their fortunes by genociding the Indians, and swindling the Indians, and poisoning the Indians with whiskey, and outright blowing their heads off. You know what had their agents blow their head off. The bankers don't get their actual hands dirty, but they're more than willing to pay hitmen to do it. So the Astors got their fortunes through murder, genocide, and fraud. And yet, in this book, boy, the Astors were respectable bankers. And the Astors and the other bankers looked upon Boss Tweed's corruption as a thing of shame. Like, how could you do that, Boss Tweed? You know, we're entrusting our funds to you, and you are embezzling them. Shame on you. It was just, give me... This is rejected knowledge. A couple of years ago, I read myself through the book, The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers, who was a muckraking journalist from the turn of the century during the era of the muckraking journalists. Except he, unlike Upton Sinclair and even Ida Tarbell, even still has some renown now, unlike those two, Gustavus Myers, he is largely forgotten, and I think that's not altogether accidental, because he really went after the oligarchs in America, the real government, in other words. He really laid them bare. He shined a flashlight on those cockroaches, and none of his historical facts, none of his charges were ever proven to be false. And yet his book today, by the, if it ever is talked about in the mainstream media, is castigated as being unfair and mean-spirited. But they never tell you it was false, because it wasn't. But for the most part, though, Gustavus Myers and his work has been flushed down the memory hole. So anyway, yeah, that's up on my archives, on the Ministry of Truth archives. You can get to that through my links page. Gustavus Myers, The History of the Great American Fortunes. And he wrote 2 other tomes, historical tomes. One of them I'm going to vote out there today, and in doing so endorse your own slavery. That makes you even more foolish when you consider how futile how utterly futile it is to vote in a system that is so corrupt that the leader has already been handpicked by the oligarchs, and they're just letting you go and push a lever and now hit a computer button, click on a mouse button, and makes you feel good, makes you feel like you did something. You did nothing but endorse your own slavery, and that's about it. I'm guessing that we're going to run into just tons, scores of examples of voter fraud right down through the history of America. And nowadays, of course, it's all the more easier with computer black box voting fraud. But it went on all through history, I'm going to guess. And it wasn't just Kennedy versus Nixon in 1960 either in Chicago. No. It was, well, we'll see. I know Gustavus Myers gets into that a little bit in History of the Great American Fortunes. A few examples of voter fraud. And if you want to know about voter fraud, man, in just about every congressional election, read the book Vote Scam by James and Kenneth Collier. Fantastic book. It reads like a detective novel. It's a page-turner, but it's all factual. Vote Scam by James and Kenneth Collier. Okay. Well, here we go. Chapter 1 of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers. Chapter 1 is entitled Resistance to Aristocracy, 1789 to 70. A flipping break. So the bankers got whitewashed. They're angels, and it's all Boss Tweed's fault. Same story we get today. You know, they'll find a rogue politician that, say, like a Daniel Trafficant that said something he shouldn't have said, and he becomes the scapegoat. Well, all of his bosses and cronies, they get off the hook. Same thing. So, I knew that someday I would want to get into this. This other work by Gustavus Myers. And this other work is called The History of Tammany Hall. If you said Tammany Hall, what was Tammany Hall to the average American, they'd go, what? They'd look at you like those street interviews Jay Leno does where he asks the most simplest, mundane question, and people's eyes glaze over. We're so dumbed down nowadays in this country. Nobody would know what Tammany Hall is. Nobody would know what Boss Tweed, who that was. But very few people would. But even those people who wouldn't know the real story. I'm guessing we're going to get the real story here on Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, etc., in this Gustavus Myers book. I'm also guessing, I haven't got into this at all yet, and so I'm going into this cold, like I usually do, but I'm guessing there's going to be examples of widespread, rampant voter fraud right from the start, right from the get-go, right from the inception of the country. And of course, that makes all you people who still going to begin in a few seconds here. And what got me wanting to read this? A couple of years back also, I was out of town, and I didn't bring enough books to read. I ran out of books to read, and I had to break down and go to the only game in town, a Borders bookstore. And if you're any kind of regular listener, you know my feelings about big chain bookstores. It's all crap in there. It's all pablum. Especially in the history section. It's all whitewashed. Vanilla history. You'll never get truth in there, folks. But I had to get something, so I picked up a book called Boss Tweed. I forget the author's name, some mainstream historical hack. And Boss Tweed was the head of something called Tammany Hall, which was a huge, powerful political machine. It's in the 1800s. It was at its zenith. In the mid 1800s, And I wanted to find out a little bit about this Boss Tweed character that I kept... His name kept coming up quite a few times peripherally in Gustavus Meyer's other work. But he didn't go into Boss Tweed in any kind of detail other than to say the guy was corrupt, basically. So who was this Boss Tweed guy? I said, well, I'll take a chance, see what I can glean from this mainstream historical hack's account of Boss Tweed, the head of the Tammany Hall in the 1800s. What was the guy's name? Acker? No, not.